Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. 400 Years of War. Admiral K'Varn had been fighting wars for 412 years, which was long enough to learn that every species eventually decided something was too expensive. For the Raylan, it was ships. For the Asen, it was officers. The Thurn would fight through the loss of entire fleets but retreated the moment civilian habitats came under serious threat. The Vaelkari understood such thresholds well because their own was painfully simple: people. A Vaelkari soldier might train for 30 years before joining a line regiment. An officer could accumulate a century of tactical experience. A ship commander might remember battles that had become academic history to younger civilizations. Lives were therefore preserved whenever possible, wounds healed. Given time, Vaelkari bodies rebuilt damaged tissue with an efficiency few known species could match. Bone restored itself without scarring. Organs regrew, skin closed. Even catastrophic injuries could be survived if enough of the body remained and medical intervention arrived quickly. But regeneration took time. Sometimes regeneration took months. Sometimes it took years. Death was different. A dead Vaelkari represented centuries that could never be replaced. That truth had shaped their military doctrine. Vaelkari doctrine therefore emphasized careful fighting. Withdrawal before losses became irrational, and inflicting enough casualties that the enemy reached the same conclusion first. K'Varn had used that principle against 23 species. It had never failed him until Bastion Reach. He stood on the command deck of the dreadnought Vigilant Sentry and studied a projection of the human defensive network. 6 inhabited systems formed the Reach, positioned around a chain of jump lanes valuable enough that both governments had claimed strategic necessity. Neither side wanted extermination. Neither side intended planetary bombardment. The conflict was limited. Which made attrition useful. Human casualty totals from the last 12 engagements, K'Varn said. The intelligence display changed. The numbers were high. The numbers were not catastrophic yet, but they were high enough to matter. The human defenders had lost infantry, engineers, vehicle crews, pilots, and support personnel at a rate K'Varn considered unsustainable. He turned to the intelligence officer beside him. They continue reinforcing Bastion 4. Yes, Admiral. From where? Reserve formations. Some personnel transferred from rear area duties. K'Varn studied the numbers again. Humanity's lifespan fascinated him. A healthy human might live a century if fortunate, many less. Their bodies deteriorated with age, they scarred, they lost limbs permanently, they could not simply regrow a destroyed lung. Their physiology seemed desperately temporary. They should value every surviving year, K'Varn said. The intelligence officer looked at him. Humans do appear highly protective of life. Then this campaign will end soon. He did not mean the words cruelly. K'Varn respected the human defenders. They were aggressive, imaginative, and professionally stubborn. Their artillery doctrine was excellent. Their engineers had turned freight tunnels into fortified routes faster than Vaelkari planners thought possible. Their command structure tolerated local initiative to a degree that made intelligence prediction unpleasant. But they were still mortal. They were painfully mortal. K'Varn expanded the map. Continue pressure on their forward depots and troop concentration zones, avoid civilian targets, prioritize engagements that force personnel losses over territorial gain. An officer acknowledged. K'Varn looked toward Bastion 4. Break enough bodies, he said, and their government will decide the Reach is not worth the price. It was not hatred, it was arithmetic. For 400 years, arithmetic had worked. Chapter 2. The Fragile Species. The biological briefing arrived before the next assault. K'Varn read it twice. Humans were worse at healing than he had assumed. Fractured bones required weeks or months. Major nerve injuries could leave permanent weakness. Severe burns produced scarring. Spinal damage could cause irreversible paralysis. Destroyed limbs did not regrow at all. Human physicians compensated with surgery, prosthetics, artificial organs, transplantation, and rehabilitation. Compensated was the word the briefing kept using. The word appeared repeatedly in the medical analysis. K'Varn found it depressing. A Vaelkari officer entered the strategy chamber carrying the updated intelligence summary. Admiral. K'Varn looked up. Their regenerative capability is effectively non-existent. Compared with ours, yes. They cannot restore what is lost. The officer hesitated. Often no. K'Varn studied the human defensive positions. Then loss should frighten them. The officer did not answer. It seemed self-evident. The upcoming assault targeted Bastion 4's Western Transit District, where human engineering units had fortified an elevated freight interchange into a defensive choke point. K'Varn expected resistance. He got more than expected. Human drones filled the lower levels with decoys. Automated weapon stations forced Vaelkari infantry into narrow access routes. When one human command post was destroyed, subordinate teams kept fighting without waiting for centralized orders. The Vaelkari still advanced. Experience mattered. K'Varn's officers had spent decades studying urban breaching. They isolated the human strongpoints, cut communications between sections, and forced the defenders into withdrawal. By the 6th hour, Bastion 4's Western District belonged to K'Varn. The humans had paid heavily. So had he. 34 Vaelkari were dead. Several dozen more had injuries serious enough to require long regeneration. K'Varn felt each loss like a missing piece of history. The humans had lost far more. Their withdrawal remained orderly. That irritated him. He had expected panic once the casualty rate climbed. Instead, human engineers demolished 2 access bridges behind them, delaying pursuit with precise charges. One demolition brought down part of an elevated transit structure. Several humans had not cleared it in time. Vaelkari search teams recovered survivors. One was a combat engineer named Damon Chiswick. K'Varn did not notice the name at first. He noticed the injury report. The report listed thoracic trauma, multiple fractures, pulmonary damage, and major blood loss. Humans listed him as alive. K'Varn assumed that was temporary. Then he visited the field hospital. Chapter 3. The Man with Half a Chest. Vaelkari doctrine required senior commanders to inspect enemy casualty conditions whenever local medical truces permitted. K'Varn had always supported the practice. A commander who reduced war to colored icons became dangerous. The temporary hospital on Bastion 4 operated under battlefield medical protections honored by both sides. Human surgeons worked in one wing. Vaelkari physicians worked in another. Prisoners were treated according to injury severity rather than uniform. That pleased K'Varn. Civilization should survive even when diplomacy had failed. The human wing smelled of antiseptic, heated polymers, blood, and something K'Varn's translator identified as cauterized tissue. He had seen battlefield medicine before. Human medicine looked crude in some ways, effective in others. A nurse moved between patients checking fluid lines. Another adjusted a machine forcing air into a wounded soldier's lungs. Blood products hung in transparent bags. K'Varn found that particularly primitive-looking until he learned humans routinely transferred blood and blood components between compatible individuals. They carried replacement circulation into battle. The practice struck K'Varn as crude until he understood how deliberately humans had built systems around biological limits they could not remove. Dr. Nisha Calderwood met him beside the trauma section. She was a compact human with tired eyes and a voice that suggested she had no emotional energy available for ceremony. "Admiral, Doctor, you're here for the medical inspection." "Yes." "Then stay out of my sterile fields." K'Varn liked her immediately. She led him past several recovering patients. One had lost a leg below the knee. Another had extensive facial burns. A third slept beneath a respiratory hood. Then K'Varn saw Damon Chiswick. He stopped. The human's right chest was a construction site. Large sealed dressings covered damaged tissue. Stabilization hardware held shattered ribs in approximate alignment. Drainage tubes emerged from beneath the bandaging. Part of the chest wall had been temporarily reconstructed with surgical mesh and rigid supports. One shoulder was immobilized. K'Varn looked at Nisha. "He survives." "So far." "His thorax has been destroyed." "Damaged." "That distinction seems optimistic." "It is." She checked a monitor. Collapsed and lacerated right lung, multiple rib fractures, chest wall disruption, clavicle fracture, major blood loss, shoulder damage, plus smaller injuries I'm not listing because we'd be here all day. K'Varn absorbed the implication. A Vaelkari with comparable trauma would enter regenerative suspension. Months, perhaps more than a year. The human stirred. Nisha immediately moved closer. Damon's eyes opened. Confusion passed over his face, then recognition. "Doc. You're in the field hospital." He tried to move. Nisha put a hand on his shoulder. Don't. Damon stopped. What happened? The transit deck came down. He swallowed painfully. The position. Abandoned. His eyes closed for a moment. K'Varn expected grief. Instead, Damon opened them again. How long until I can go back? K'Varn looked at Nisha. The doctor stared at her patient. Not today. Damon's mouth twitched. Didn't ask about today. K'Varn's translator rendered the sentence perfectly. He assumed that meant the machine was broken. Nisha checked Damon's pupils. You're lucid. Unfortunately. Good, then you'll understand this. She adjusted something in his intravenous line. Damon narrowed his eyes. What do you give me? An end to this conversation. His eyelids began lowering. That's cheating. I'm your doctor, it's called winning. Damon tried to object. Sleep got there first. K'Varn stared at the unconscious human, then at Nisha. Was that delirium? No. He requested return to combat. Yes. He has part of his thoracic structure temporarily replaced with mesh. Yes. He cannot stand. Also yes. K'Varn looked back at Damon. This is encouraged. Nisha's expression hardened. No. That answer surprised him. Chapter 4. Wanting is not clearance. K'Varn followed Nisha into a quieter corridor. If such behavior is not encouraged, why did he ask? Because he's Damon. That does not explain anything. It explains more than you'd think. Nisha stopped at a medical terminal and pulled up Damon's treatment plan. K'Varn expected perhaps several weeks of care. The schedule stretched for months. Another thoracic surgery after stabilization. Rib reconstruction, respiratory therapy, shoulder rehabilitation, strength recovery. Functional testing, psychological evaluation, return to duty assessment, possible occupational reassignment. K'Varn read the list. You do not intend to return him soon. I don't intend to return him at all unless he meets clearance. Yet you did not tell him he could never return. Nisha looked toward the ward. Because I don't know that. K'Varn stared at her. You believe that man may fight again. I believe he may work again. Maybe combat engineering. Maybe something else. With that damage. With whatever we can repair. K'Varn folded his hands behind his back. Among my people, similar injuries would require prolonged regenerative suspension. How prolonged? My own worst recovery lasted 22 months. Nisha looked at him. You've been hurt that badly. Worse, perhaps. And fully regenerated. Yes. She nodded, lucky bastard. K'Varn was not certain whether he had been complimented. He looked back toward Damon. Your species cannot regenerate him. No. Then why would he even think of returning? Nisha sighed. Admiral, soldiers ask for ridiculous things when they're injured. Some want to go back before the stitches are dry. Some think pain is negotiable. Some believe being stubborn counts as a medical credential. And you permit that? No. Her voice became very flat. Wanting to go back is his problem. Deciding when he's allowed is mine. K'Varn absorbed that. That distinction mattered more with every report. Damon's request was not doctrine. It was desire. The system around him existed partly to prevent that desire from killing him. K'Varn asked, will he return? Nisha glanced toward the ward. Ask me in 6 months. K'Varn almost laughed at the absurdity. Then he realized she was serious. Chapter 5. The Casualty Equation. The war continued. K'Varn won 3 more engagements. Human territory contracted. Their casualty numbers rose. Their combat power should have fallen accordingly. It did not enough. A human infantry battalion lost nearly a third of its personnel defending a supply junction. 9 days later, the formation appeared again at reduced strength, merged with a reserve company and operating under a new commander. A vehicle regiment lost several senior officers. Junior officers stepped up. A damaged engineering unit vanished from the front, then reappeared attached to another brigade with replacement personnel integrated into its teams. K'Varn reviewed the reports personally. How many of their wounded returned to duty? His intelligence staff had no immediate answer. The omission bothered him because it meant His casualty models were measuring injury more carefully than they were measuring recovery. Track it. Admiral, minor wounds are already included in readiness estimates. I did not ask about minor wounds. He pulled up the casualty model. Human losses were divided into killed, wounded, missing, and recovered. Recovered meant medically stable, not necessarily useful. Determine how many return to their original role, then how many return in modified duty, then how many are reassigned. The analysts began working. The first report arrived 2 days later. K'Varn read it in silence. Some wounds were trivial. Some wounds were minor, sprains, burns, superficial fragment injuries, and meant little to the larger calculation. Those meant little, but others did. Soldiers with fractures returned after healing. Pilots with injuries moved into instruction, then back into cockpits. Personnel who could no longer meet combat standards took logistics or training roles. A communications specialist with permanent hearing loss had been reassigned to drone operations. A wounded officer ran planning from a rear headquarters while recovering. K'Varn enlarged one chart. Human combat capability dipped after each major engagement, then rose again. The formations did not recover fully, but they recovered enough. They are replacing losses quickly. An analyst answered, partly. Partly. Replacement personnel account for some recovery. Returned wounded account for more than predicted. K'Varn returned his attention to the map. Humans still lost people permanently. Dead remained dead. Some wounded retired. Others never returned to military service. Yet the category he had assumed meant removed did not mean removed often enough. Revise the attrition model. The analyst hesitated, using what assumption? K'Varn looked at Bastion Reach. I do not know yet. Admitting that he did not yet know how to model humanity was new. Chapter 6. Repair instead of regrowth. A temporary medical exchange gave K'Varn an excuse to investigate. The human rehabilitation facility stood far behind the front, protected under the same agreements governing major hospitals. Nisha met him there. You again. You appear disappointed. I've treated military inspectors. You're one of the less annoying ones. K'Varn decided that was definitely a compliment. The facility resembled neither a hospital nor a barracks. Humans exercised in large therapy rooms. Some wore braces, some used powered prosthetics, others practiced ordinary tasks under supervision. K'Varn watched a pilot repeatedly move a mechanical hand across a set of flight controls. The movements were slow, awkward. The human dropped a control grip, picked it up, tried again. His hand will not regenerate, K'Varn said. Nisha shook her head. No. Can he fly? Not yet. Will he? Maybe. They moved on. An infantry officer walked between support rails. A stabilization implant had been placed along part of her spine. Her legs worked, poorly. Every step required visible concentration. In another room, a technician with an artificial eye calibrated depth perception against a moving display. Nearby, a logistics specialist worked at a desk while one leg remained immobilized. K'Varn pointed. That individual is still receiving treatment. Yes. Why is he working? He asked for light duty, and his physician approved it. He cannot perform his previous physical role. Correct. Then why retain him? Nisha stopped walking. Because his old function isn't the only useful thing he knows. K'Varn watched the recovery teams through the glass. The logistics specialist was explaining supply routing software to 2 younger soldiers, not lifting cargo, not running, teaching. He thought of Vaelkari recovery. When severely wounded, his people withdrew almost completely from duty. Regeneration demanded rest. Centuries of doctrine treated partial capacity as distraction from full recovery. Humans had no guarantee of full recovery. So they used partial capacity. They walked past a counseling wing. K'Varn noticed the security was gentle but deliberate. What is treated there? Combat stress, trauma reactions, sleep disorders, other psychological injuries. Do those personnel return? Some. And the others? Some change jobs, some retire, some don't recover enough to continue. Nisha looked at him. We don't get everyone back, Admiral. K'Varn believed her. That made what he had already seen more impressive, not less. Nisha took him through one more wing before he left. It was quieter than the physical therapy rooms. Here, Personnel worked through aptitude testing, retraining plans, and modified duty evaluations. A former infantry sergeant with permanent damage to one knee was learning battlefield logistics software. A sensor technician who could no longer tolerate high acceleration was helping write maintenance procedures for younger crews. Neither looked pleased about losing the work they had once done. Humanity did not erase that grief. It simply refused to make grief the final administrative category. K'Varn understood then that rehabilitation was not one department. It was a network for preventing knowledge from disappearing simply because a body could no longer perform the same task. Chapter 7. The Immortal's Recovery. That night K'Varn dreamed of a battlefield 280 years earlier. He remembered heat, the collapse of an armored corridor, metal passing through his abdomen, a medical team cutting away parts of his uniform while his body tried to seal bleeding faster than it could manage. Then darkness. He had woken weeks later in regenerative suspension. His left lung had been rebuilding. Part of his liver was gone, several vertebrae had fractured. Doctors assured him he would recover. They were right. 22 months later, K'Varn returned to command. No scar remained, no limp, no reduction in lung capacity, perfect restoration. Vaelkari medicine had considered it a triumph. It was, yet he had spent nearly 2 years absent. K'Varn sat awake in his quarters. Damon Chiswick returned to his thoughts. A human could not be restored perfectly. If Damon survived, his ribs would remain reconstructed. His lung might never perform at full capacity. Pain might persist. Yet Nisha had said 6 months, not as promise, as possibility. K'Varn opened the human casualty reports again. He began measuring something different, time until usefulness. The results changed the shape of the war. He pulled his own medical history from the Vaelkari archive and placed it beside several human cases. The comparison was almost insulting to Vaelkari biology. His regenerated lung was perfect. His rebuilt vertebrae were indistinguishable from the originals. But for 22 months, all of that perfection had produced no admiral. During that time, junior officers carried his duties, often badly because Vaelkari command culture assumed the original expert would eventually return. The human records showed something messier and strategically more robust. One wounded commander had resumed planning from a hospital workstation before she could walk unassisted. Another never returned to combat at all, but had rewritten evacuation doctrine based on the ambush that injured him. Human medicine did not always restore the person who had existed before. Human institutions were designed to extract value from the person who still existed afterward. Vaelkari regeneration remained vastly superior biologically. A wounded Vaelkari could eventually become exactly what they had been before, but until then, they were usually unavailable. Humans returned imperfect people to useful roles before perfection was even possible. Some returned to combat. Some moved elsewhere. Some carried their experience into training. K'Varn sat with the numbers until morning. Then he changed strategy. Chapter 8. K'Varn adapts. If human casualty recovery was preserving combat power, then the recovery system itself was strategically relevant. K'Varn would not attack hospitals. He rejected the idea before any subordinate proposed it. Medical protections existed because civilized war required limits. But hospitals did not stand alone. They depended on transport, equipment, training grounds, reserve staging areas, repair depots. K'Varn shifted pressure toward those systems. Vaelkari forces struck military transport junctions that moved casualties from forward aid stations to rehabilitation centers. They targeted supply depots containing replacement prosthetics, surgical components, and vehicle parts. They disrupted reserve assembly areas. The effect appeared quickly. Human return-to-duty rates slowed. Frontline units remained under strength longer. K'Varn felt grim satisfaction. The model made sense again. Then Brigadier Sorcha Denholm responded. Human rehabilitation dispersed. Civilian medical networks began taking military cases farther from the front. Mobile surgical teams moved closer to casualty collection points. Recovering personnel were transferred into training commands rather than concentrated in large facilities. Reserve units split across multiple staging locations. A logistics node K'Varn destroyed turned out to have 3 redundant routing centers. He destroyed a second. The humans switched to civilian freight software. A Vaelkari intelligence analyst looked almost offended. They are making the system less efficient. K'Varn studied the network. No. The analyst looked at him. They are making it harder to stop. That distinction mattered more with every report. K'Varn ordered another strike against a military transit corridor. This time, human engineers restored the route faster than predicted. The commanding officer caught K'Varn's attention. Damon Chiswick. K'Varn stared at the name. Verify identity. The analyst did. Same service number, same combat engineer, same man. K'Varn checked the date. 6 months and 17 days since Bastion 4. He remembered Nisha. Ask me in 6 months. K'Varn stood. Get me the full report. Chapter 9. The man with the broken chest. Damon had not returned unchanged. The medical file made that clear. He had undergone 3 major thoracic procedures after the original damage control surgery. Several ribs had been reconstructed using internal fixation and synthetic reinforcement. His right lung had healed but remained below previous capacity. Scar tissue reduced expansion under extreme exertion. His shoulder had lost some range of motion. He could no longer meet the unrestricted heavy lifting requirement expected of certain combat engineers. Human military medicine responded by changing his classification. Modified field duty, command and technical engineering approved, prolonged load carriage restricted, heavy manual tasks delegated. K'Varn read that section twice. The human military had not pretended Damon was as capable as before. It had changed what it asked him to do. During the transit corridor battle, Damon had supervised a bridge restoration under artillery fire. Not by lifting girders, by directing teams, sequencing drones, selecting reinforcement points, and coordinating armored movement. His unit reopened the route 17 minutes before Vaelkari models predicted it possible. Human vehicles counterattacked through the corridor. K'Varn lost the position. He was not angry about the defeat. He was fascinated by the man who had contributed to it. Several weeks later, a prisoner exchange created an opportunity. K'Varn went personally. He told himself it was professional curiosity. He did not entirely believe that. Damon stood near the human exchange line wearing combat engineer gray. K'Varn recognized him immediately. The human looked thinner. A faint stiffness affected one shoulder. When he turned, K'Varn saw the way he favored his right side after prolonged standing. Still human, still damaged, still there. Damon noticed him. His eyebrows rose. The hospital admiral. K'Varn approached. You remember me. You're hard to miss. K'Varn looked at his chest. The injuries were hidden beneath uniform now. You came back. Damon smiled. Told you I was going to. Your physician did not. The smile widened. She said not today. K'Varn actually laughed. Damon looked pleased with himself. Then K'Varn asked, does it hurt? The humor softened. Sometimes. During work. After mostly. Cold environments aren't great. If I overdo it, I know about it. Yet you returned. Doctor cleared me. You obeyed. Eventually. K'Varn thought of Nisha. I find that difficult to believe. So does she. A human officer called Damon toward the exchange line. He turned to go. K'Varn asked one final question. Can you do everything you did before? Damon shook his head. No. He glanced toward the engineers waiting for him. Enough, though. Then he walked away. K'Varn watched him until he disappeared into the human group. Enough remained the useful measure. The words stayed with him. Chapter 10. The wrong species. K'Varn returned to Vigilant Century and ordered every casualty model rebuilt. His analysts argued at first, not about the order, about the categories. Human personnel did not remain inside them. Wounded combat personnel became trainers. Pilots became mission planners during rehabilitation. Maintenance specialists with mobility restrictions moved into diagnostics. Infantry officers who could no longer pass field requirements joined doctrine staffs. Some later returned to combat. Others did not. A single casualty could pass through 3 different states in a few months. An analyst finally asked, Admiral, what casualty pressure do you now consider necessary to force human withdrawal? K'Varn looked at the order of battle display. Stop asking how many we hurt. The room went quiet. He pointed toward the human formations. Find out how many stayed gone. The revised model took 3 days. K'Varn disliked the result. Human forces were weaker than at the beginning of the campaign. They had lost people. That mattered. But not nearly as many capabilities had vanished as his original calculations assumed. Experience persisted, sometimes inside the same body, sometimes inside another person who had been trained by the wounded one, sometimes in doctrine, sometimes in recordings, sometimes in changed procedures written after failure. K'Varn thought about his own species. Vaelkari continuity lived in individuals. A commander survived long enough to remember a century of war personally. Human continuity had no such luxury. A human life was too short, so their institutions remembered for them. The realization did not make them unbeatable. Nothing was unbeatable. But it meant the campaign K'Varn had designed was aimed at the wrong target. He had expected to reduce human military capacity by damaging human bodies. The humans had spent centuries preparing for bodies to fail. Then Brigadier Denholm attacked. Chapter 11. The Offensive. The first sign was artillery. Human guns opened across 3 fronts at once, not with overwhelming volume, with precision. Vaelkari forward sensors disappeared. Communications relays followed. Then engineering units moved. K'Varn recognized the pattern immediately. The humans were not attempting a broad breakthrough. They were opening corridors, one through a collapsed industrial district, another across a flooded transit cut. A third over a ravine K'Varn's staff had classified as impassable to heavy vehicles. Damon Chiswick's unit was assigned to the ravine. K'Varn watched drone footage. The human stood beside a mobile bridge system, one hand braced against a console while crews worked around him. He did not carry the heaviest components. Others did. He directed. The bridge deployed under fire. Vaelkari artillery struck one section. Human engineers repaired it. A second strike damaged a support vehicle. They rerouted power. Armored vehicles began crossing. K'Varn ordered a counterattack. It hit hard. Vaelkari troops fought with the accumulated discipline of soldiers who had trained together for decades. Human units took losses. They did not stop. A flight package appeared over the eastern front. The lead pilot's intelligence file flagged a previous severe hand injury. K'Varn zoomed in. Adaptive control interface. Prosthetic integration. The pilot had returned. A logistics network feeding the center assault was being coordinated by an officer wounded months earlier in a Vaelkari strike. Another return. Another capability K'Varn's original model had erased. The offensive did not feel like an army that had escaped injury. It felt like an army assembled from what injury had failed to remove. K'Varn's forces inflicted damage. Human medevac craft moved immediately. Reserve teams filled gaps. A company commander went down. Her deputy took over without asking headquarters. The battle continued. By the second day, the Vaelkari still held most major objectives. By the third, supply routes became strained. K'Varn could reinforce. He could continue. He could also see where the campaign was going. His own seriously wounded soldiers would regenerate, eventually. Many would require months, some years. Human wounded from this battle were already being divided into categories of treatment, rehabilitation, reassignment, and replacement. The attritional advantage had reversed, not because human casualties were cheap. The opposite was visible everywhere he looked. Human commanders rerouted aircraft to evacuate single critical patients. Engineers risked equipment to open safer casualty lanes. Units slowed assaults rather than abandon wounded personnel. They were spending enormous resources to keep people alive. What K'Varn had misunderstood was what happened after survival. A wounded human was not automatically removed from the war forever, and a dead human's knowledge was not allowed to die as completely as Vaelkari doctrine assumed. Humanity had built redundancy around mortality because mortality was unavoidable. K'Varn looked at the strategic map. He had fought long enough to recognize when persistence became stupidity. Prepare phased withdrawal from the central reach. Several officers turned. One looked shocked. We still hold Bastion 3. Yes. We can contest the human advance. Yes. Then why withdraw? K'Varn looked at the casualty projections. Because I know what tomorrow costs. He ordered the retreat. It was disciplined. Vaelkari formations disengaged carefully. The humans pursued, but Sorcha did not waste soldiers attacking prepared withdrawal corridors. K'Varn respected that. By the end of the week, the front stabilized. Negotiations began. K'Varn spent the first night of the ceasefire reading the revised casualty model one final time. The numbers no longer looked like a list of bodies removed from the board. They looked like branching paths: dead, retired, reassigned, rehabilitating, returned, teaching, commanding. The categories were untidy, but the untidiness was the point. Human capability leaked sideways instead of disappearing cleanly. He had tried to fight a species, as though breaking a person meant breaking everything that person knew how to do. By then, he understood why that assumption had failed. Chapter 12. Too stubborn to stay down. Brigadier Sorcha Denholm arrived at the ceasefire station without ceremony. K'Varn had expected someone older. Then he remembered human lifespans. She was perhaps in her 50s, old enough for decades of experience. Young enough by Vaelkari standards to be considered barely started. They negotiated boundaries, prisoner exchanges, transit access, medical protections. Neither side got everything. That meant the talks were probably useful. During a recess, K'Varn stood beside the observation window with Sorcha. Below them, human and Vaelkari recovery teams crossed the temporary demarcation line. K'Varn asked, "Do your people understand how fragile they are?" Sorcha looked at him. "That sounds like a dangerous question." "I mean biologically." "Then yes. You cannot regenerate." "No. You return wounded personnel before my people would consider recovery complete." "Sometimes." "Why?" Sorcha leaned against the rail. "We don't tolerate casualties, Admiral. We spend a ridiculous amount of effort trying to prevent them." K'Varn watched the recovery teams through the glass. A human medical vehicle moved past. Sorcha continued. "And when prevention fails, we don't automatically throw away what's left." That was all, no speech, no declaration of human uniqueness. She returned to the negotiating table. K'Varn stayed at the window. A human engineering team crossed the lower concourse. Damon walked among them. He carried a tablet instead of equipment. One younger engineer asked him something. Damon stopped, pointed toward a damaged support structure, and began explaining. Still scarred, still limited, still useful, K'Varn watched until the team disappeared. Then he returned to negotiations. Chapter 13. The New Equation. Peace did not happen instantly. Wars rarely ended cleanly. There were arguments over patrol routes, disputes over captured equipment. A border incident nearly restarted fighting 3 weeks after the ceasefire, but the major shooting stopped. K'Varn ordered Vaelkari military academies to study the campaign. The first draft of the analysis irritated him. It described humans as unusually tolerant of casualties. K'Varn rejected it. The second described humans as possessing exceptional biological resilience. Rejected again, the third was closer. It focused on recovery systems. The final analysis focused on medical evacuation, rehabilitation, cross-training, adaptive equipment, delegated command, reserve integration, and institutional continuity. K'Varn approved it. He added one note: "Do not classify severe human injury as permanent loss until actual disposition is known." A young officer reading the report asked him, "Is that not overly cautious?" K'Varn thought of Damon waking beneath tubes and surgical mesh. "How long until I can go back?" He thought of Nisha refusing to indulge him. "Not today." Then the bridge, the returned pilot, the logistics officer. "No," K'Varn said, "it is accurate." Chapter 14. What Remains? K'Varn visited Bastion 4 once more before leaving the Reach. The transit district had been rebuilt. The elevated structure that collapsed during the first battle was gone. A replacement route crossed the gap. Human crews worked beside Vaelkari inspectors under the ceasefire's reconstruction agreement. Damon stood near the new bridge. K'Varn approached. The engineer looked up. "Admiral." "Engineer. You here to destroy this one too?" K'Varn considered the question. "No." "Good, they're a pain in the ass to rebuild." K'Varn looked at the bridge. "You designed part of this." "Some reinforcement changes." "And your chest?" Damon laughed, still attached. "I meant your medical status." "Cleared for this work." K'Varn nodded. Damon shifted his weight. There was still stiffness, still cost. K'Varn saw it now because he knew to look. "You will never fully recover." Damon's expression became thoughtful. "Depends what you mean by fully." K'Varn waited. Damon tapped his chest. "This won't be what it was." Then he gestured toward the bridge. "But I'm here." For once, the answer required no analysis. K'Varn realized he had spent much of the campaign asking whether Damon had returned to what he was. That had been the wrong question. The man before him had lost strength, range of motion, lung capacity, and months of his life to recovery. He had also gained experience no uninjured engineer possessed, and humanity had found a way to keep using it. The body was not restored. The life had continued. K'Varn offered his hand. Human custom. Damon took it. They shook once. Then K'Varn left Bastion Reach. For the first time in 4 centuries of war, he carried home a strategic lesson taught to him by a species that could not even regrow a rib. Epilogue. Not today. 9 years later, K'Varn watched a joint disaster exercise on Vaelkari territory. Human and Vaelkari rescue teams practiced extracting casualties from a collapsed orbital habitat. The exercise was supposed to be routine. Then a real support strut failed. A young Vaelkari officer was struck by falling equipment. The injury was serious. The officer had suffered pelvic fractures and internal tissue damage. Nothing Vaelkari regeneration could not eventually repair. The attending physician estimated 8 months before full recovery. The young officer was furious. I can continue simulation work. You require regenerative rest. I can instruct. You require rest. K'Varn watched the argument. A human rehabilitation specialist standing nearby asked, would limited cognitive work interfere with regeneration? The Vaelkari physician paused. No. Would seated instruction? Not if physiological demand remained low. The young officer looked from one to the other. K'Varn stepped closer. The physician straightened. Admiral. K'Varn looked at the injured officer. For a moment he saw another hospital, a shattered human chest, a man barely conscious beneath surgical hardware asking when he could return. K'Varn said, not today. The human rehabilitation specialist glanced at him. The young officer looked furious. K'Varn continued, ask again when he is ready. The human smiled. K'Varn pretended not to notice.